Dad said he's divorcing you. The words still echoed like a punch to the gut. A short, devastating sentence that exploded in the air like a grenade, destroying everything around it. My daughter stood in front of me, her innocent eyes reflecting a weight she shouldn't have to carry. But she carried it. And me? I no longer knew if I was feeling anger, humiliation, or if it was all just a nightmare from which I would soon wake up. But I didn't wake up. I stared at her, mute, trying to absorb what had just happened. She clutched her cell phone in her shaking hands, as if hoping it could protect her from what came next. I felt the bitter taste in my mouth, the cold sweat running down my back. That moment seemed so far from reality, but it was real. And what made everything worse was the sepulchral silence that took over the room after that. My mind screamed, refused to accept. I wanted to ask, I wanted to know why, how, since when. But no words came out. I could only hear the echo of my own heavy breathing as the clock on the wall continued to tick away mercilessly, as if every second was confirmation that everything I had built was falling apart. I remember how everything started to fall apart. That smell of perfume that wasn't hers. The insistence on getting too dressed up to meet your friends. The messages on her cell phone that she hid so carefully, as if they were precious secrets. And me? I ignored it. I thought it was all in my head, paranoia from someone who was perhaps insecure. But it wasn't. I knew. Deep down, I always knew. When I finally looked at my daughter, she looked down. There was no hiding it. She knew. She saw. Maybe you heard the muffled arguments, the whispers on the phone, the blank stares. She saw everything, and still tried to protect me from the truth until the last moment. But the truth, this damned truth, could no longer be hidden. My wife, the woman I loved, who I protected, who I put above all else, had betrayed me. And it wasn't just any betrayal. It was a premeditated, calculated betrayal, planned in silence while I did everything I could to keep her happy. I was there, putting food on the table, paying for the trips, the luxuries, and while I was doing that, she was somewhere else, with someone else, experiencing something I couldn't even imagine. The worst? I thought we were fine. She smiled, kissed me, hugged me as if nothing was wrong. And I believed. I believed it so much that I bought her a gift that morning. 2 tickets to a paradisiacal place, just for the 2 of us. It was my plan to rekindle the love, to reconnect. I was so blind that I didn't see the abyss beneath my feet. And now here I was, facing the brutal truth. Shock turned to anger. Anger turned to fury. And the fury, for a brief moment, turned to despair. I wanted to understand. I needed to understand. Why did she do this? Why did you destroy everything? Why did you lie to me, to our daughter, to our family? It was then that I decided to act. I couldn't let her get away with it. I needed to show her what it meant to lose. I needed to take her off the pedestal I had placed her on all these years and make her feel the weight of the consequences. And I knew exactly what to do. My daughter tried to grab my arm when I got up, but my mind was made up. I picked up the box with the gifts I had prepared for that night, the wine, the chocolates, the tickets, and walked out the door. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breathing was labored. Each step to the car seemed to push me forward, moving me away from the man I was and closer to the man I needed to be. When I arrived, the scene was worse than I imagined. There she was, laughing, throwing her hair back, as if the world was perfect. And him? He touched her arm, looked into her eyes as if he had some right to be there. The blood boiled. I wanted to move forward, I wanted to break everything, I wanted to scream. But I controlled myself. I had a plan. I entered smiling. They turned around at the same time, surprised by my presence. I handed her the box, feigning innocence, watching the panic grow in her eyes. She tried to say something, but I raised my hand, silencing her. The lover looked at me, confused, trying to understand what was happening. It was then that I opened my mouth, and the words came out sharp as blades. I hope you enjoy tonight. Because it will be the last. And then, without saying anything else, I placed the ticket envelope on the table and left. I left them there, frozen in their own fear, trying to process what had just happened. As I walked back to the car, I felt something different. A chill down my spine, but also a determination that I hadn't felt in years. That betrayal wasn't going to destroy me. It wasn't going to define who I was. But she would pay. And not just her, him too. I didn't know exactly how, but I was sure I would find a way. A way to make them understand what they had lost. Because I wasn't just any man. And that pain, that chaos, would be just the beginning. The beginning of something much bigger. The story of how I burned down the world I built for her, and made sure she watched as it all fell apart. Welcome to the channel where truths about betrayal are exposed without filters. Here, we do not support and never justify any type of betrayal. Our stories are fictional, but they carry real lessons about how disloyalty can devastate lives, destroy families, and leave deep scars. Get ready to dive into an intense narrative, full of emotions, secrets, and unexpected twists. Take a deep breath, because what you're about to hear is simply shocking. Good story. Lucas tightened his tie in front of the mirror, pulling it with slight discomfort, as if the piece symbolized something more suffocating than it should. His eyes fell on the wedding photo on the nightstand. He looked so young in that image, smiling as if the entire world was at his feet. And maybe he was. Life with Helena seemed like a promise fulfilled, a dream come true without any deviations. She looked beautiful in that white dress, her hair tied up delicately, but what stood out most was the sparkle in her eyes. A glow he swore was for him and him alone. Lucas closed his eyes for a moment and took a deep breath, trying to dispel the uncomfortable feeling that had invaded him lately. Helena was always the type of woman who attracted attention wherever she went. Not just for her classical beauty, but for the way she spoke and moved, conveying a natural elegance that seemed innate. When they met, he found himself immediately captivated. She had that kind of presence that made people lean a little closer when talking. It was magnetic. And he was proud of it. He was proud to have her by his side and to be the man who made her happy. Or at least, that's what he believed. In the first years of marriage, the house was full of laughter. They decorated every corner together, discussing wall colors, choosing furniture, and making plans for the future. It was in this home that they built memories that, for Lucas, were unbreakable. Nights of wine and long conversations on the balcony, impromptu weekend trips and tight hugs after a difficult day. He liked to think that these moments still meant something to her as much as they did to him. But in recent months, things had changed. Helena was more distant, although she continued to smile at the right moments and casually touch his arm in public, as she always did. However, there was something in her eyes, an absence that Lucas couldn't name, but that he felt like a growing emptiness. She went out more, always with excuses for meetings, appointments and events that he never knew were scheduled. When I asked, she smiled and said that she needed these things, she needed to feel alive. Lucas agreed, although deep down something inside him seemed to wither a little more each time he heard that. Still, he tried. He tried to maintain the routines, the dinners together and the surprises that used to rekindle the passion between them. That night, for example, he had prepared everything for a romantic dinner. She cooked, set the table with candles and even had her favorite song playing softly in the background. But Helena arrived late, blaming the traffic and tiredness. He kissed him quickly, praised his effort, but asked to postpone the celebration. He smiled and said he understood. Because, deep down, I wanted to believe that this was just a phase. The truth was that Lucas still saw Helena as the center of his world. He remembered the beginning, how she made him laugh and how she knew exactly what to say when he was about to break down. He remembered their trips, their plans for children and how they dreamed of growing old together. That's why he insisted. So he ignored the signs. Because accepting that something was wrong would mean questioning the entire foundation on which he had built his life. Helena, on the other hand, seemed to float through that space as if she no longer belonged there. She kissed him in the morning and told him she loved him before bed, but there was a weight to her words that Lucas tried not to notice. She also struggled with the doubts that haunted her. She loved Lucas, or at least that's what she told herself, but she missed something that she couldn't define. I missed the intensity of the first years, the newness, the adrenaline. And he hated himself for it. She looked at Lucas and saw a dedicated, loving and trustworthy man. She knew he would do anything for her. And perhaps that was exactly what suffocated her. Not because he controlled her, but because he loved her in a way so pure that he made her feel guilty for wanting more. She wanted to feel wanted again, she wanted to lose herself in something other than security and routine. And that was what haunted her. While Lucas tried to win Helena back silently, preparing dinners and bringing flowers, she moved away a little more. Not because of a lack of love, but because of fear of admitting to herself that maybe that wasn't enough anymore. But she also didn't want to lose what she had. She didn't want to give up that stability, that man who looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. That night, after Helena went to sleep, Lucas stayed in the living room, looking at the set table that he had prepared with so much care. The candles had already gone out, the wine remained untouched, and the silence in the house seemed heavier than ever. He wondered at what point they had started to lose each other. I tried to remember some exact point, but everything seemed so subtle, so gradual, that it was impossible to pinpoint the moment they started to move away. In the room, Helena slept, but her mind remained restless. He thought about the decisions he had made, the paths he chose and how everything seemed to be slipping through his fingers. She wanted to hold on, wanted to save what they had, but part of her felt like maybe it was already too late. Meanwhile, Lucas looked at the clock. He felt a tightness in his chest, as if time was running out and he needed to do something before it was too late. But what he still didn't know was that time had already passed. And that the choices made in recent months were about to unleash a storm from which neither of them would emerge unscathed. Lucas woke up with the sun hitting his face, but the light didn't bring the comfort of a new day. He felt heavy, like he was being pulled to the bottom of a well. The last few days had been a tangle of confusing thoughts and sensations he couldn't name. The emptiness in his chest grew every minute, and the feeling that something was wrong continued to hammer in his mind. He stood up slowly, ran his hands over his face and looked at the side of the bed. Helena wasn't there. The pillow still had the imprint of his head on it, but it was cold. Lucas looked at his watch. It was early, too early for her to have left without warning. He descended the stairs with heavy steps, listening to the echo of silence that took over the house. In the kitchen, he found a hastily scribbled note. I had to leave early for an appointment. I'll be back before dinner. I love you. Lucas held the paper for a moment, feeling the weight of the words. I love you. It was funny how that sentence, which had once warmed him, now seemed empty. He tried to ignore the thoughts and continued with his routine. He washed his face, had a quick coffee and left for work, but the feeling didn't leave him. During the day, he found himself looking at his cell phone, waiting for a message or call that never came. Helena used to send affectionate messages, even on busy days. But now the silence seemed to scream. At lunch, Lucas tried to distract himself by talking to colleagues, but his mind kept returning to home. For her. For the weird hours and vague excuses. For the perfume that wasn't hers. He tried to push the thoughts away, but they came back with more force. In the evening, when Helena finally arrived, Lucas had already prepared a simple dinner. She came in smiling, kissed him on the cheek and praised the smell of the food. But something about her smile seemed out of place. They ate dinner in silence, exchanging short sentences about work and the day. Lucas watched her every move, every averted glance, every nervous laugh. When they finished, Helena said she was tired and went up to her room. Lucas stayed at the table for a few more minutes, looking at the empty plate and the chair where she had been sitting. He felt like he had been eating alone for weeks, maybe months. In the following days, the feeling of restlessness only increased. Helena continued to leave early and return late. The excuses became more vague, and Lucas began to notice details that had previously gone unnoticed. Her phone was always face down. Messages were answered hurriedly and followed by a strange smile. The clothes seemed tidier, more fitted, and the perfume stronger. Lucas tried to talk, tried to ask if something was wrong. But Helena always avoided it. She said everything was fine, that she was just overwhelmed with work and needed space. He wanted to believe it, but something inside him screamed that it wasn't just that. He began to notice the times when she would go out on dates with friends, and not return until midnight. The days when her cell phone rang and she went out to answer it away from him. It was then that Lucas made a decision. He needed to know. I needed to stop pretending everything was fine. He needed to face the truth, even if it destroyed him. On Friday night, Helena said she had an important meeting and would probably be back late. Lucas pretended to believe, gave her a quick kiss and said he would wait. But as soon as she left, he grabbed his car keys and decided to follow her. His heart pounded in his chest as he kept his distance, watching her car turn corners and go down streets he didn't recognize. When she finally parked, Lucas stopped a little further back and watched. She got out of the car, looked around and entered a restaurant. It didn't look like a meeting place. It was discreet but elegant. The kind of place couples went to escape prying eyes. Lucas waited for a few minutes, fighting the urge to enter immediately. But he wanted to be sure. He needed to see it with his own eyes. Then he got out of the car and entered the restaurant. His heart was beating so hard that he almost couldn't breathe. When he saw her, it was as if time had stopped. Helena was sitting at a table in the corner, smiling. But it wasn't for him. She held another man's hand, looked into his eyes as if he were the center of the world. They laughed, toasted, and leaned into each other in ways Lucas couldn't ignore. He felt the ground disappear beneath his feet. The pain was instantaneous, sharp, as if someone had ripped something out of him. He stood there for a moment, unable to move, unable to breathe. Then he took a step back, then another. He left the restaurant without her seeing him, but the images continued to burn in his mind. Back in the car, Lucas gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to process what he had just seen. He felt betrayed, humiliated, but most of all, he felt empty. The images of her smiling, touching another man's face, felt like a nightmare he couldn't wake up from. He sat there, sitting in the car for hours, reliving every moment, every detail. Trying to find some sign, some clue that he might have ignored. But it all seemed obvious now. She wasn't just distant. She had walked away because she already had someone. When he finally returned home, Lucas sat in the living room, in the dark. The clock said almost 3 in the morning when Helena entered. She tried to be silent, but he was already awake. She looked at him with surprise, maybe even a little guilt. He asked why he was awake, but Lucas didn't answer. He just looked at her, letting silence fill the space between them. Helena looked away, mumbled something about being tired and went up the stairs. Lucas stood still, listening to her footsteps towards the bedroom. He felt like something inside him had broken, something that might never be fixed. He knew that night would change everything. I knew that nothing would ever be the same again. But what he didn't know yet was that this was just the beginning. Because what was coming was so much bigger than he could ever imagine. Lucas didn't sleep. He spent the night sitting on the couch, staring into space, feeling the weight of a betrayal that seemed to crush every piece of his soul. The silence in the house was deafening, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the wall. The image of Helena smiling at another man was still alive in her mind, an open wound that wouldn't stop bleeding. He tried to find explanations, tried to imagine justifications, but all he could feel was a bitter, suffocating emptiness. When the sun began to rise over the horizon, illuminating the room with a pale, cold light, Lucas stood up with determination. He needed answers. Helena went downstairs slowly, surprised to see him still awake. She stopped on the top step, holding onto the railing as if it could support her. Lucas turned to look at her, and for the first time in years, his eyes didn't convey love or understanding. They were hard, cold, as if the person he had been had disappeared in the night. Helena opened her mouth to say something, but he cut her off before she could speak. He asked her directly where she had been the night before. His voice was firm, but it carried a tone of pain that Helena couldn't ignore. She hesitated, her gaze shifting for a moment, before replying that she had been stuck in a meeting and then gone out to have drinks with colleagues. Lucas didn't let it go. He approached, his eyes fixed on hers, and asked again, this time with more force, as if his life depended on that answer. Helena tried to maintain her composure, but the tension in the air was palpable. When he said he saw her at the restaurant, her expression changed. Her face lost color, and she took a step back, as if she had been hit. He tried to deny it, mumbling excuses and disjointed explanations, but Lucas already knew. He had already seen it. There was no more room for lies. He demanded to know who the man was and how long this had been happening. Helena began to cry, her words coming out in a broken voice, saying that it wasn't what it seemed, that it was a mistake, that she felt lost. But Lucas didn't believe it. He pressed her, increasingly furious, until she finally screamed. She admitted that she was having an affair, that she felt stuck in a routine and wanted something different. She said she never wanted to hurt him, but that she needed to feel alive again. Lucas stared at her in silence for a long moment, trying to absorb those words. Did you need to feel alive? And him? Was he dead all this time? But her confession wasn't what hit him the most. There was something more, something she hadn't yet said. He felt it in the way she trembled, in the fear that hovered in her eyes. And then he asked. He asked what else she was hiding, because he knew there was something beyond that betrayal. Helena tried to deny it, but he insisted. She fell onto the couch, tears streaming down her face, and said she didn't know how to tell him. Lucas knelt before her, holding her hands, begging for answers. It was then that she told him. He said that the man he was with was someone close to him, someone he knew. Lucas felt his heart stop for a moment before asking who it was. Helena hesitated, as if saying the name would destroy everything once and for all. When he finally said he was his best friend, Lucas felt the ground disappear. The man he trusted, with whom he shared secrets, with whom he laughed and vented, had become his wife's lover. The betrayal wasn't just hers. It was his too. It was a double betrayal that ripped apart every part of his confidence and left him breathless. He got up, walked around the room like a caged animal, not knowing what to do. He asked her how it started, why she allowed it to get this far. Helena cried, saying it was a moment of weakness, that he was there to listen to her when she felt alone, that she never planned this. But Lucas couldn't hear. His mind was in chaos. He thought about the conversations, the casual encounters, the smiles exchanged between the two. Everything took on a new meaning, a new layer of pain. Lucas turned to Helena, asking if she still loved him. She said yes, through tears, but her words seemed empty. He asked if she loved him or was just afraid of losing the comfortable life they had built together. Helena didn't know how to respond. Lucas took the car keys and left the house. I needed air, I needed to escape that suffocating environment. He drove aimlessly, his hands shaking on the steering wheel, his mind full of images and words that he couldn't erase. He thought about confronting his friend, about destroying him, but he knew that none of that would erase what had happened. When he finally returned home, it was already night. Helena was sitting in the living room, her eyes red from crying. He stopped at the door and stared at it, trying to decide if there was anything left to save. She got up, walked over to him and tried to touch him, but Lucas backed away. He said he needed time, he needed to think, because it was all too much to bear. Helena begged for forgiveness, saying she would do anything to fix what she had broken. But Lucas didn't know if it could be fixed. He felt betrayed on every level, as if his entire life had been built on lies. He went up the stairs and closed the bedroom door, leaving Helena alone in the room. He sat down on the bed and put his head in his hands. I didn't know what I would do next, but I knew nothing would ever be the same again. That night, Lucas looked at the wedding ring on his hand and wondered if that symbol still meant anything. Deep down, I knew it wasn't. He knew everything had changed. But what he still didn't know was what was coming. Because as painful as the betrayal was, the real scam was still hidden, waiting to be revealed. Lucas sat on the bed for hours, staring at the floor as if waiting for some answer to appear there. The silence in the room only increased the noise in your head. He felt his heart beating heavily in his chest, as if each beat reminded him of the pain that was now part of him. He got up, walked to the window and looked out, but the darkness seemed to reflect the emptiness he felt inside. Downstairs, the dim light in the room was still on. Helena must have been waiting for him. Maybe waiting for him to come down to continue that unfinished conversation. But Lucas didn't know if he was ready to face anything else. Hours later, when he finally went downstairs, he found Helena sitting on the sofa with her eyes swollen. She looked up when she saw him, but said nothing. Lucas sat in the armchair in front of her, maintaining a distance that seemed greater than the physical space between them. She tried to say something, but he raised his hand, asking for silence. I needed to speak first. He needed to get rid of it before it exploded. He asked why. Not just about the betrayal, but why with him? Why with someone he trusted, someone who was part of their lives? Helena took a deep breath, drying her tears before saying she didn't know how to explain. She said she didn't want it to happen, but it did, and when she realized it, she was already too involved. She tried to justify that she felt alone, ignored, and that his friend was there, listening, supporting, offering a shoulder that she thought she needed. Lucas couldn't believe what he was hearing. He interrupted her, saying that he never left her alone, that he was always there for her. She lowered her head, unable to look at him. He asked if she loved him. He asked if the other meant more to her than he did. Helena hesitated before answering, and it was at that moment that Lucas felt as if the last hope had been snatched away. She said she loved him, but there were times when she felt like something was missing. That the other made her feel wanted, alive, and that was something she hadn't felt in years. Lucas shook his head, got up and walked around the room, trying to contain the anger that grew with each word. He asked if she had any idea what she had destroyed. If she understood the extent of the damage she had caused. Helena cried, saying she didn't know how to fix it. She said she loved him, that she wanted to save the marriage, that she would do anything. Lucas laughed, but it was a bitter laugh, full of pain. He asked her if she really thought it could be fixed, if she thought he could look at her again without seeing another man's hands on her body. The discussion escalated. Helena started screaming that he was also to blame, that their routine had killed their relationship, that she tried to warn him, but he never noticed. Lucas countered by saying that she never said anything, that she chose to lie, deceive, instead of talking and trying to resolve it. He said she destroyed trust, and without it there was no marriage to save. He took the car keys and left, leaving her in the middle of crying. He drove aimlessly, his heart racing and his hands shaking on the steering wheel. He stopped in an empty park and sat in the car, trying to make some sense of it all. But the more I thought, the more I realized that their marriage had become a lie. He didn't know how to turn back. I didn't know if I wanted to go back. When he returned home, it was already dawn. Helena was sitting in the kitchen, her eyes red and tired. She stood up when he entered, but Lucas raised his hand again, asking her not to speak. He said he didn't know what to do, but he needed space. He said he couldn't sleep in the same bed as her, not that night. He grabbed a pillow and went to the couch. In the following days, Lucas tried to remain distant. I avoided long conversations, limited interactions to the basics. Helena tried to get closer, but he moved away. He needed time to understand what he felt, to find out if there was any future for them. But something inside him said that it was already over. The situation got worse when he found his friend, the man who had stolen his trust. It was by chance, in a cafe where Lucas used to stop after work. The two stared at each other for a few seconds, and the silence between them seemed to scream. Lucas walked up to him, eyes fixed, and asked how he had the courage. The friend tried to explain himself, saying that he didn't plan it, that he didn't want to hurt him, but Lucas didn't want to listen. He said he had destroyed everything, that he had ended a friendship of years for something that should never have happened. Lucas left the cafe feeling like every tie in his life was being severed. He felt alone, betrayed, as if the entire world had turned its back on him. But at the same time, he began to feel something different. A desire to start over, to leave that behind. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but he knew he couldn't live in that pain forever. That night, he returned home determined. He called Helena to talk, but this time his voice was firm, without hesitation. He said he couldn't continue. That, as much as he wanted to, he couldn't get over what happened. He said he wanted a divorce. Helena started crying again, begging him to reconsider, but Lucas stuck to his decision. He said he had already tried. Said she broke something that couldn't be fixed. Helena asked what would happen to the house, to their daughter, to everything they had built together. Lucas said they would resolve this calmly, but that he could no longer live in that lie. She asked him if he still loved her, but he didn't answer. Instead, he grabbed his car keys and left once again, knowing that this was the last time he would walk through that door as her husband. As he drove, Lucas felt a mixture of pain and relief. He knew he was leaving an important part of his life behind, but he also knew he needed to move on. I knew the path would be difficult, but I was ready to face whatever came my way. He looked at the horizon and, for the first time in a long time, felt like there was something new waiting for him. Something he couldn't see yet, but he knew was there, waiting for him. Lucas drove for hours that night, aimlessly, as if the movement of the car could take him away from the confusion inside his head. The streetlights passed quickly past the window, but he could barely see them. His mind was stuck on the last words he said to Helena, on the final decision he made to file for divorce. Even though it had sounded firm at the time, now I felt the weight of that choice spreading across my chest like an anchor. He had ended everything, severed the bond that held them together, but part of him still fought the emptiness it left. He pulled the car into an empty parking lot, turned off the engine and remained silent. His hands continued to grip the steering wheel, as if letting go symbolized something definitive, something he wasn't yet ready to accept. He remembered the wedding day, how he held Helena's hands at the altar, promising to be by her side under any circumstances. Now those same hands seemed so far away that he wondered if he had ever really met her. He picked up the phone and stared at the screen. There were unread messages from friends asking if he was okay, messages he didn't have the energy to respond to. He opened the gallery and saw the old photos. Helena smiled in each one of them, and that smile seemed different from what he had seen in recent months. It was as if the woman he loved had disappeared, leaving only the shadow of who she used to be. He felt his chest tighten, but he forced himself to put the phone away. I needed to stop looking at the past. When he returned home, he found Helena sitting in the living room, still awake. She looked up when she heard the door open, and her eyes looked tired, as if she, too, had spent the last few hours fighting her thoughts. Lucas stopped for a moment, feeling the weight of that look, but forced himself to move on. He walked past her without saying anything and went up the stairs, leaving behind the smell of the perfume he once loved and now only served as a reminder of his betrayal. In the living room, he looked at the bags he had started packing earlier. She sat on the edge of the bed and ran a hand through her hair, trying to calm her mind. The silence was almost unbearable, but before he could get lost in it, he heard footsteps in the hallway. Helena appeared at the door, hesitantly, as if she knew her presence was unwanted but still needed to be there. She asked to talk, said she needed to say something before he decided to leave forever. Lucas looked at her and saw tears running down her face, but he felt unable to move. He said he had already heard everything he needed, but Helena insisted. She said she knew she had no excuse for what she did, but she wanted him to know that what she felt for him was still real. Lucas laughed humorlessly, asking how she could say that after everything she did. He asked her if she thought words would be enough to erase the images he had in his head, the scenes of her with another man. Helena knelt in front of him, begging him to listen to her. She said she knew she made a mistake, but that she was willing to fight for them, to do anything to prove that there was still something to save. He stared at her, trying to find some truth in those words, but all he felt was a mix of anger and pain. He asked her if she really believed that they could go back to what they were before, that they could forget all that as if it hadn't happened. Helena shook her head, saying that she didn't want to forget, but that she wanted to learn from her mistakes. She said she was willing to rebuild herself, if he would just give her a chance. Lucas stood up abruptly, moving away from her as if he needed space to breathe. He said he no longer knew who she was, that her every word seemed like a desperate attempt to hold on to what was left. He asked if she really wanted to be with him or if she was just afraid of losing the stability, the security that he represented. Helena cried louder, saying that she was afraid, but that the fear was of losing him, not the comfort. He said that everything he did was out of weakness, because he felt invisible, but that he now saw clearly what really mattered. Lucas felt his throat tighten, but he didn't let the tears fall. He asked if she would have stopped if he hadn't found out, if she would have confessed on her own or continued with the lies. She was silent for a few seconds, and that was enough for him. He said he didn't need anything else, that hesitation said it all. He picked up his bags and went down the stairs without looking back. Helena followed him, begging him to stop, but Lucas could no longer hear. When he reached the door, he turned for the last time. He said that maybe one day he would be able to forgive her, but that at that moment all he felt was pain. He said he couldn't continue living with someone he no longer trusted. Helena tried to hold him back, but he moved away, closing the door behind him. Lucas drove to a hotel, where he spent the night staring at the ceiling, trying to imagine what would come next. He knew he needed to move on, but part of him still struggled with the idea of starting over. He thought about his daughter, how she would deal with all this, how she would explain that their marriage was over. In the following days, Lucas immersed himself in work, trying to occupy his mind. He avoided any contact with Helena, answering only what was necessary about legal and financial issues. But with each message from her, I felt my stomach turn. He knew she was trying to rebuild what she had destroyed, but to him it seemed impossible. The moral dilemma began to weigh more heavily when his daughter asked if they still loved each other. Lucas felt his heart sink, but he responded calmly, saying that love can change and that, sometimes, people need to follow different paths to be happy. He hugged her tightly, feeling the weight of that conversation and the responsibility of not letting resentment contaminate his relationship with his daughter. While dealing with the divorce procedures, Lucas began to notice small changes in himself. He started to take better care of himself, started exercising again and started hanging out with friends he had left aside over the years. He felt, little by little, regaining control over his life. However, what he still didn't know was that the impact of that betrayal went far beyond the marriage. The secrets that began to emerge over the next few days would make him question even more who he could trust and leave him faced with choices that would change his future forever. Lucas looked at the divorce papers spread out on the lawyer's desk, the words written there seeming colder than he imagined. Everything he and Helena had built was being reduced to clauses and numbers, a formal division of assets that failed to capture what had really been lost. He signed each page with steady hands, but he felt a growing emptiness with each signature. When he handed over the papers, the lawyer asked if he wanted a moment to reconsider, but Lucas just shook his head and said he had already made his decision. He left the office feeling like this was the end of a part of his life, and although it hurt, there was also a strange feeling of relief. On the way back home, he thought about everything he had been through since discovering the betrayal. He thought about the sleepless nights, the screams, the tears, the moments when he almost gave in and tried to forgive. But he knew that forgiveness wasn't enough. Trust had been destroyed, and nothing Helena said or did would be able to restore it. He tried to remember the good times, the promises made and the plans for the future, but everything seemed so distant that it was as if it belonged to another life. When he arrived at the temporary apartment where he was living, he found his daughter sitting on the sofa, waiting for him. She looked at him with a mixture of curiosity and concern, as if trying to decipher what was going on. Lucas sat next to her and took a deep breath before explaining. He said that he and her mother had decided to go their separate ways, but that it wouldn't change the love they felt for her. She was silent for a moment, then asked if he was okay. Lucas smiled, but his eyes betrayed the pain he still felt. He said he would be fine, that they both would be, and hugged her tightly. Helena, on the other hand, seemed to sink a little more every day. Since Lucas left home, she has tried to find him several times, calling, texting, even showing up at his work unannounced. But Lucas stood his ground, refusing to back down. She started blaming herself for everything, reliving every moment when she could have made different decisions. I would spend hours sitting in an empty room, staring at the phone and waiting for a call that never came. She tried to move on, tried to pretend to others that she was fine, but the truth was that she felt like she had lost more than her marriage. She lost trust, she lost her daughter's respect, and most of all, she lost the version of herself that she believed was immune to mistakes like this. The lover, in turn, faced immediate consequences. After Lucas revealed the affair to his wife, the relationship also fell apart. He was kicked out of his home, lost his children's respect, and faced a bitter divorce process. To make matters worse, news of the case spread, and he ended up losing his job when the story reached his boss. With no family, no job and no money, he was forced to leave the city, but he took with him the weight of regret and the shame of having destroyed not only a marriage, but also the most important friendship he had. Lucas began to rebuild himself. Little by little, he started going out with friends again, took up hobbies he had abandoned, and eventually started meeting new people. But he knew he needed time before he opened his heart again. However, fate seemed to have other plans. At one of his work events, he met someone who made him laugh again, someone who made him feel that maybe it was still possible to believe in love. It was a natural connection, no rush, no expectations, and for the first time in a long time, Lucas felt like he was ready to try again. Helena found out about the new relationship through her daughter, and it hit her like a final blow. He tried to hide the pain, but he felt the weight of regret growing. She finally understood what she had lost and knew, in that moment, that she would never have a second chance. She began attending therapy, trying to rebuild herself, but she knew that the shadow of her mistakes would follow her forever. Months later, Lucas and Helena met for the last time in court to formalize their divorce. He looked at her and realized how much she had changed. There was no longer any arrogance or confidence in her eyes, only regret. Helena tried to apologize once again, but Lucas just thanked her for everything they had experienced and wished her to find a new path. She cried as he walked out the door, knowing it would be the last goodbye. Lucas moved on. He found a new love, rebuilt his life and learned to value his own happiness above anything else. He still carried the scars of the past, but instead of letting them define who he was, he used them as reminders of how much he had grown. Helena continued trying to find redemption, but knew that some wounds never heal completely. And so the story came to an end, leaving each character facing the consequences of their choices. Lucas continued with a promising future, Helena was trapped in the past she destroyed and her lover was forced to face the loneliness caused by his betrayal. Each of them learned the hard way that trust, once broken, is almost impossible to restore. If you've made it this far, don't forget to leave your comment saying what you thought of this story. Your opinion is very important to us. And if you're not yet subscribed to the channel, sign up now to follow more impactful stories like this. Remember, the channel does not support and will never justify any type of betrayal. Stories like this serve to show the real consequences of the decisions we make. Until next time.